Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. It's Heather Hurlburt back again, Executive Director at the National Security Network, and I'm here today with...
Eric Posner. I teach at the University of Chicago Law School.
And Eric and I are here today to talk back and forth on a variety of international issues, starting with global warming and President Bush's speech yesterday, and then moving on to what a new president will face in 2009 and what kinds of serious differences we can or can't expect between a Democratic and Republican approach. And before we start, I just have to promise my faithful fans that I will interrupt Eric ruthlessly and viciously this time and not let him talk for too long, as I have been accused of doing in the past.
And I'm sure I'll give you many opportunities to do that, Heather.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this is the remedial session in how not to let your partner talk for too long. So starting off with President Bush's Rose Garden global warming remarks yesterday, Eric, you've written quite a bit on this. Your take.
Yeah, well, so it's received a great deal of criticism, as everybody expected. I'm going to defend it. I don't think his speech was as bad as many people say it was. There was a certain amount of nonsense, which we can talk about, but he made a couple good points. One good point is the danger of existing litigation, tort litigation and Clean Air Act litigation. I think there's a serious concern that this litigation could interfere with sensible climate policy. And the second point I think that he made that was correct was that he didn't emphasize this so much in his remarks, but the White House has long took this position, which is that you can't have a good climate treaty unless the big developing countries are parties to it and have obligations under it. And he emphasized this, and some of his aides emphasized this more at this speech. And it raises an interesting question, which is, what's the role of this legislation, like the Lieberman-Warner bill? I have a feeling, although I'm not terribly confident about this, but that it'd probably be premature to enact such a law, at least before a serious climate treaty has been agreed to.
Well, I have to say I'm a little cynical about the litigation point for two reasons. First, of course, the reason there is so much litigation is that the federal government has done nothing on this set of issues on Bush's tenure, and there have been plenty of opportunities. The states have asked them. In fact, big business has asked them, and so we don't need to have the litigation issue that we now have. And secondly, the minute that I see, as Jim Connaughton, the head of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, sort of saying, this is going to prevent schools from being able to modernize because somehow the federal government is going to be imposing climate standards on individual elementary schools across the U.S., that sort of sets off all of my, this is a bunch of scarifying about nothing, alarm bells.
That's certainly part of the nonsense part, and I'm not going to disagree with you. There's a lot of troubling stuff. For example, it's going to cost a lot of money to have a sensible climate policy, and politicians don't like to say that that means either raising taxes or having something equivalent to that. And saying that we're going to invest a lot in research doesn't get around that, because that costs money as well. So, but I do think that, and you're quite right to be cynical about the Bush administration. That they clearly haven't led. And they're behind the rest of the world, and they're certainly behind people in the United States. It is important, though, that Bush, who's a right-wing Republican, has said that he agrees that there's a significant challenge that has to be addressed eventually through legislation and a treaty. That's very important. And on the litigation side, it's not. You're right. It's understandable. It may do good in the sense of stimulating the federal government to actually do something. But the problem is if the federal government doesn't actually do anything, the litigation is very unlikely to have any effect on climate. That is to say, it'll be costly, but it's not going to help with the problem of global warming.
On the, let's see, I had several things I wanted to say, and I'm losing the order I wanted to say them in. Back on I guess the first thing was on the question of sort of which comes first, the national program or the international treaty. That confuses me a little bit, because if you take the approach, as I think you do from your writings, and as actually quite a few people across the ideological spectrum do now, that what you're going to end up having is some kind of international agreement that codifies in one place a number of national plans that don't necessarily look alike, sort of that you don't require everyone to cut emissions in exactly the same way, then there's no reason in the world that the U.S. shouldn't go ahead and start figuring out what the best way for us to cut emissions is. And indeed, arguably, it would give us a stronger negotiating position. It would give whoever the next president is a stronger negotiating position internationally if it were apparent that we were doing something at home other than lawsuits. So I'm a little bewildered as to why it's not a good idea to go ahead domestically if that's your idea of what the global regulatory framework ultimately looks like. And the second thing I did want to say about the speech, which is I agree with you on the point that it's better for a Republican president to be saying we need to address global warming than not. And I thought it was interesting to look at the range of environmental group responses, and I think it was the folks at Environmental Defense who said, well, we're happy he's talking about it.
Right.
The timing of it, I was also trying to work out a little bit, because you have these negotiations among the big emitters taking place in Paris today and tomorrow, and you also have real momentum in Congress that some people think there will be a version of Lieberman-Warner or something similar to it that makes it out of the House and the Senate in the next 6 to 8 weeks. So it was clearly an effort to try to influence both of those processes, but I had a little trouble seeing exactly how it was supposed to influence either of them. It was it's hard being a president in your 8th year was sort of my overall reaction to the speech.
I mean, there's very little he can do, but I think it's better for him to talk than to be silent. So you make two very good points, and let me address both of them. I think actually it would weaken our bargaining power rather than strengthening our bargaining power if legislation was enacted, and here's why. It's true that the United States looks good, and a lot of other countries don't trust us, and we've certainly mishandled the climate policy for many years. But the absolute biggest problem for climate policy is getting China and India and other developing nations to agree to mandatory restrictions. They have been pretty clear that they're not willing to do this. At the same time, countries, especially a country like India, is going to suffer a lot from global warming. So the United States and Europe have to be able to say to these countries, look, if you want us to reduce our emissions, you're going to have to reduce your emissions as well. And if we're already committed to do so through legislation, it'll make it harder for us to get them to agree to significant cuts in emissions. I think that is the single most difficult issue. It's just that, China's emissions apparently have already exceeded America's on an annual basis. And even if America shut down its entire industry, if China and India and these other growing countries, Brazil, Russia, if they don't do anything, it's not going to have much effect in the long term.
Well, the linkage you make, Eric, is actually not the linkage that I would choose to make, in that it's in our interest, both for our own air quality here at home and for our ability to develop and eventually market new technology. It seems to me it's in our actually own interest to go ahead and start dealing with this now. Again, you have the situation where business, at least big businesses, it's the funny position that you actually have. One of the reasons you have a split within the Republican Party is that you have big business saying, please go ahead and give us a national regulatory framework and end this uncertainty where we don't know what we're going to be facing in 5 or 10 years.
Before we have an Obama administration, please do it. Right, that's the subtext, right?
Oh, I'm sure.
They're hoping for a weaker bill while the Bush administration still exists.
Well, of course.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, as you know, there was a big debate within the Democratic Party about whether there should be a try for a bill next year, whether there should be a try for a bill this year, or whether you should hold off, use it to beat the Republicans with, and then try for a stronger bill.
I think they should try for a strong. I don't know how this partisan stuff works, but I think they should wait and try for a stronger bill in the context of serious climate negotiations with China and the other major economies. I think we're going to get either the best or worst of all possible worlds, which is, from the speech yesterday, it certainly sounded to me like anything that comes out of Congress this year, this president would veto.
which would put him in an interesting situation, I have to say, because it's not clear to me that a veto helps him or helps McCain or helps the party. So that it's an interesting political gambit that you could imagine.
Well, I think I'm not very good at reading this rhetoric, but it sounded like, and the reporters were pressing. Was it Connaught? Is that his name? The head of the commission on this.
Yes.
It sounded like that the administration didn't want to commit itself to rejecting mandatory standards. That is to say, it sounded like it was an opening sort of negotiating position. I mean, my instinct is that the Republicans will look very bad if the Democrats come up with a reasonable seeming bill and Bush vetoes it. So it may be just an attempt to ensure that whatever bill comes out is watered down enough that businesses that support the Republican Party won't get too upset. Will be happy, and they'll think. And the businesses presumably will think that if there's a watered-down bill, that will reduce the political pressure for a really serious bill during the next administration, which would be unfortunate.
Yeah, it's interesting because my impression is that there are actually some fairly serious negotiations going on among business, labor, and the environmental movement, which might actually lead to getting a bill this year. And I take your point on the one hand that there could be a stronger bill potentially next year. On the other hand, if you think of the huge press of issues there are going to be to deal with next year, just the sort of political pragmatist in me says anything we can get out of the way and start implementing now, we probably should. It's a very unusual, unpartisan view on my part. But,
so I want to try to encourage you to take the long view, I guess. I mean, this is what worries me, is that it's not a domestic problem. Global warming is not a domestic problem. In the sense that, and I mean, of course, it's going to harm people in the United States, but it's going to harm people elsewhere in the world much, much more. So if you have a purely domestic deal among Americans, American businesses, American labor, environmentalists have, of course, a more global perspective. But if business and labor have a lot of influence on it, it may well be something that Americans can live with. But it's not going to help people in India. Because Americans, basically, don't care that much about people in other countries. And that's why you need international negotiations, where these other countries can say to the United States, look, you're going to be hurt by global warming, we're going to be hurt by global warming, let's make a deal. The deal's going to have to reflect our interests, otherwise we're not going to join in. And it's going to have to reflect your interests, because we understand that you're not going to join in unless it does. And then this treaty, and this gets to a point you made earlier. Why not just have all these countries enact legislation on their own and then just have the treaty ratified? I don't think people appreciate quite yet, although they will soon, just how complicated this problem is. That is to say, there has to be real global regulation that's going to be highly intrusive, and it's going to require a tremendous amount of coordination among different states. It's probably going to end up being a cap-and-trade system, which means creating lots of these permits, allocating them to countries, and making sure that each of these countries, when they then turn around and sell permits or give permits to industry, don't cheat on the deal. That's the real concern, that you're given a certain number of permits, let's say in Nigeria, and the country sells them and then also doesn't try to shut down industries that continue to emit greenhouse gas emissions without having purchased a permit. So all of this stuff has to be worked out. I think that whatever you think about the Bush administration, there are reasons why it's taken so long. There are very complicated distributional issues and technical issues that are going to have to be hammered out. And I think I'm afraid it really does have to be done before the legislation is put in place. For it to be most effective. Now, if the legislation is put in place, that's not going to destroy things, but I think it'll actually make it more complicated rather than easier to produce a sensible climate treaty.
Now, I agree completely with you about how complicated it's going to be, but I reach exactly the opposite conclusion, that means we should go ahead and start both practically, because if you assume it takes several years to hammer out a global cap-and-trade system, then at least we've started the process of cutting emissions domestically. And second, I still think it gives us more leverage internationally to be doing something than to be doing nothing. And I wanted to ask you, because you've written actually from an interesting perspective about how do you help the people in the poorest countries who are, as you say, the ones who are going to be most effective. And to me, that's the great sort of bargaining chip that the U.S. has, not our own domestic actions, but what we can do to assist people in India and China and low-lying islands, I mean, places that are really poor, as opposed to India and China, and just say, when we get a binding system or a system that's moving toward binding, because what folks at the UN have described to me about how this process, how the UN sees the process developing, and I just report this without sort of expressing an opinion about it, is that their expectation is that you start out with binding targets for developed countries and, actions, non-binding actions, sort of targets that aren't binding for developing countries, with the expectation that over the next 20 to 30 years they move into binding targets. And as I say, that's just how it looks from the UN. I'm not sort of taking a moral position on that. But the big piece of leverage that the developed world has there is creating a system that, as part of lowering emissions, affects some transfers of resources as well. And so I was surprised, because you do have kind of an interesting perspective on that you didn't mention it.
Well, yeah, this is an additional complication, but I guess what do you mean by having? I'm not sure that gives us leverage. One of the complicating issues about global warming is that whatever we do today or in the next 10 years is not going to affect anybody today. It's going to affect people in 50 or 100 years, and so people are going to continue in the low-lying areas. In India and Bangladesh and even poorer places, they're going to suffer a lot in the near term. And there's basically, we can't do anything about that through a climate treaty. We can only do something about that by basically giving money to these countries or the people who live in those countries. And there's this tension, there's this big tension, because if you think either for moral reasons or for just, political reasons, we should be helping the poorest people elsewhere in the world, it's not clear that the climate treaty is a good way to do it. It's certainly not the most effective way to do it. The most effective way is foreign aid, which has, of course, lots of problems, but it's a lot more effective than, helping poor people 50 or 100 years from now.
Well, going back to something you said earlier about, basically saying this is the dimension of climate change that the American public hasn't really grasped at all, it's something I would like to see a new administration be able to get onto, trying to talk about. In the ideal world, it's something that those Al Gore ads would be talking about. Al Sharpton and Pat Robertson is cute and all, but so you'd like to see, and to me, this is another argument for getting the domestic piece out of the way a little bit, so that we can focus on the international piece. But it actually triggered for me that the two things, three things that I was disappointed about the Bush speech was, number one, that there's no mention of that aspect of it. Number two, of course, that he doesn't see emissions peaking until 2025, which is too late. And the third thing was, what the heck good is it having a Republican administration if you give a speech on climate change and there's no element of personal responsibility in there whatsoever? There's nothing about energy efficiency. There's this McKinsey study that says we could cut the emissions growth rate in half through use of currently available technology and all the things that everybody's heard a million times about light bulbs and driving less and so on. And I was involved in writing several climate and energy speeches for several fairly prominent politicians, and it's a painful, gruesome process, I have to say, because you get all these numbers and targets and what's realistic. But I've wrestled through several times the problem of how do you talk about personal responsibility, which is a piece of this. It's not the only piece. It's not a sufficient piece, but it's a necessary piece. And it's really disappointing to me to have a Republican president who didn't say anything about that.
I'm sorry. Do you mean Bush taking personal responsibility for being a laggard, or Americans taking personal responsibility for driving SUVs?
Yep, for driving the latter.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I don't know what to say. I think that politicians don't do very well by scolding Americans for their spending habits. I'm not going to defend it. I think that it's quite clear that Americans. It's not just that that Americans emit greenhouse gases at a higher rate than people elsewhere in the world. I mean, they're perfectly sort of understandable reasons for that. The people are more spread out. We're more used to cars. A lot of the way the cities were designed and the use of cars, all of this was developed before anybody really understood anything about global warming. What is true is that Americans are just, it's an extremely consumerist society, and people consume way more than is necessary, but this is true in Europe also. It's true everywhere in the developed world, and it's very easy to make a very simple moral case, as people like Peter Singer have been doing for decades, that the wealthy people in the West should transfer quite a significant amount of their resources to poor people in developing countries. I think that the reason politicians don't want to go down that road, for understandable reasons, on the Democratic side or the Republican side, I think that's where this type of logic leads. I don't think a Democratic politician will be able to criticize Americans too much. I think and in fact, they're going to engage in subterfuges just the way the Republicans will. They'll say, look, it'll cost a little, but not very much. It's not going to change your lifestyle very much, rather than saying, this is your fault, and you should have changed your lifestyle a long time ago. That just doesn't work politically, whatever the truth is.
Right, no, that's not the way to do it, but I do actually expect, and as I say, you've seen, there's a whole kind of several years of great public oratory on global warming, which got zero attention and was but you don't do it in a sort of scolding, blaming. You have to live in front of a campfire and walk 5 miles to school uphill both ways. But in terms of, you could actually cut your electric bill by doing X, Y, and Z. There are cars available that you could drive that would get a lot more better gas mileage than what you are actually driving. You have a bus line 2 blocks from your house if you cared to investigate it. And to give people the shared sense that their neighbors were doing the same thing, that it was a sort of a great national effort. And that's where I think there's going to have to be, because it is going to be a big change in how we do things and how we fund certain things, and the public is definitely going to notice, and you can try to do it on the sly, or you can actually say, and I think there's some reason for optimism that all of the people running for president would be prepared to do this, to say, look, we're asking a lot of our corporations, we're asking a lot of government, we're going to ask a lot of citizens too, and to really try to create some kind of national sense of shared mission around this. And it's one thing that a departing president has the opportunity to do when he doesn't have a lot of levers to pull anymore. So
I guess I'm a little skeptical, because that works. It seems to me that works sometimes. It might work during real war rather than a war on terror type of war like World War II, asking people to make shared sacrifices and so forth. But this is a problem that's going to go on for decades or longer. And I think I just think Heather, what you say is appealing, but I have a feeling that politicians are going to do the opposite. What they're going to say, and I think they can actually get away with this. That is, they're going to say, look, you're going to pay slightly higher prices. They're not even going to say that, but they'll admit that if pressed. You're going to have to pay slightly higher prices. It's not clear at this point whether these higher prices are going to be significant or not. That is to say, there are all these economic models, and I gather, since you've been working on this, you're aware of them. They're highly speculative, which we have to say initially, but they, like the Nordhaus model. Nordhaus is an economist at Yale. It says, it might cost an extra 10 or 20 cents a gallon. That's not, that's a little bit in tension with the idea of sacrifice, because it seems not such a big deal, although extremely at the moment a politically sensitive issue. But anyway, this is well beyond what I really understand very well. How to get Americans motivated to go along with an expensive program, and I guess we'll just see how these different whoever our future president approaches this.
So maybe that's a good point at which to turn to some other issues where we thought we'd consider how different our future presidents would be. And you had specifically mentioned the question of whether there'll be significant difference between a McCain and an Obama or Clinton approach on the Geneva Conventions. And so you obviously have a well-developed, possibly contrarian view on that. So
contrarian, but not necessarily well-developed. So my instinct is that they're not going to act that differently from each other. In fact, I'd go so far as to say I don't think they're going to act that differently from Bush. I think that I searched the web dutifully to try to find statements about international law, and there's a little bit, and they're a little bit vague. And Obama, the biggest difference I can find is that Obama seems to be signaling that he's going to take the Geneva Conventions a little more seriously than Bush has. And Clinton is a little more ambiguous. It's this typical sort of thing. But it's not clear to me. I think that Bush may have done things badly, especially, I think, rhetorically, but I think his hands have been tied much more than people realize. And so Obama, Clinton, or McCain come into office, and they've got this problem that there are these people in Guantanamo, and you have to do something with them. You can try them. You could try them in a regular court, which is one view, and they could very well be acquitted because they've all been tortured. Mm-hmm. And what happens then? They're sent back to Afghanistan. I just can't believe that Obama or Clinton would be willing to take that risk. So you're already stretching the Geneva Conventions pretty thin by having these people in Guantanamo. It's based on this already aggressive view that this is a war as opposed to kind of a law enforcement action. I don't see how Obama and Clinton are going to be able to back off. They might be able to back off a little bit rhetorically and a little bit along the margins. They might shut down Guantanamo Bay as they've been promising, but they're going to have to put these people somewhere else. So I don't see that much of a change. So am I wrong about that?
Well, I mean, what I would expect that would happen is an Obama or Clinton administration would come in. You'd have a statement very early on saying, we respect the Geneva Conventions and we intend to abide by them, and we expect other actors who capture our people to abide by them. So that would be part one. Part two, step two would be that you would have an announcement that we intend to close Guantanamo once we figure out what to do with everybody there.
Right.
Then I think you run smack into the issues that you raise, that there's one group of people there, a small group, that there are legitimate reasons to continue holding them, but because of their treatment up to now, you can't put them into the U.S. Civilian judicial system. There's another group of people that we don't have a reason to continue holding them, but we can't actually send them back where they came from, and we have been unable to find third countries to take them. So then what I expect what a Clinton or Obama administration would do, that this administration has been invited to do but refused, is work with the lawyers and judges in the military system and in the intelligence court system to devise some kind of, to go back again to the question of how do you devise military courts that can actually deal with these issues but have a sufficient amount of transparency to them that the Red Cross and human rights advocates can actually look at them well enough to say, yes, this is a serious process and there's some modicum of respect for the rights of the individual, which people have been sort of quietly saying that this administration should do for several years now, and it hasn't shown any interest in doing so. And I think you're right that process will take a while, and that it will come out in a way that is not satisfying to the most pure human rights folks who say all these people should just go back into our civilian system and or be let go, and that we won't get there, but that you will have a system that looks a lot more like a system. With checks and balances and transparency, and not just a sort of executive privilege allows us to do, or executive privilege and the fact that we're at war, quote unquote, allows us to do whatever we want. So that's one difference that I see as not all encompassing but pretty significant. And then the second difference, I think, is just, and you seem to say this wasn't very important, and to me it's incredibly important, is that you return the process of how we make decisions about these issues and how we interpret the law to be much more in line with how it's laid out in the Constitution, and much less in line with having the principals sit around in a room and say, well, are 30 seconds of waterboarding okay? Is 50 seconds of waterboarding okay? And to me, that's a really crucial, fundamental change in how I expect a government under a Democratic administration to operate that will be different from how it's operated up to now. How much of what I've outlined a McCain administration would also do, I'm honestly not sure, because sometimes McCain is great on these issues, and frankly, sometimes he's terrible, and sometimes he talks a good game and then votes the other way. So I don't feel like I really have any sense of what a Republican administration would do on the Geneva Conventions issues.
Okay, yeah, let's stick with the Democrats then, because at least that makes a sharper contrast. So I think, what you said is really not as different. Up until your last point about sort of domestic constitutional law, it's not that different. That is to say, the Bush administration also has made the statement that it respects the Geneva Conventions. It just interprets them very narrowly. And they've also, I think, haven't they said, or at least hinted, that they want to shut Guantanamo Bay, and they want to sort of get rid of all, that's why they're trying these people finally. And so then what we're talking about, that your third point with respect to international law, is just how this trial is going to be, these trials are going to be designed. Well, you might be right that a Democratic president would produce a trial system which is a little more attractive to people who are concerned about the rule of law and due process than the Bush administration does. But from an international law perspective, I think the difference is going to be marginal. I think most people think that just detaining these people indefinitely, which is going to happen, I think, is already greatly in tension with international law. It violates basic human rights treaties. It probably violates the Geneva Conventions, depending on whether you think this is a war or not. People in other countries just think the whole business is corrupt and a violation of international law. And it's only in America where we're going to have this argument, the Democrat versus Republican argument about what exactly we should do, which is all whatever the Democrats and Republicans do, it's so far to the right of what, let's say, people in Europe think is appropriate that they're not going to be able to tell the difference.
Well, there's two things there, and one is that the great crime, to use a loaded word, of the Bush administration is doing this in such a way that we have no credible way now of going to the rest of the world and saying, out of all of the people at Guantanamo, there are 10 people who your governments would all want to keep locked up for the rest of their lives too, and these are the reasons why, and have anybody believe us. And I believe that there's a small number of people there, probably a pretty small number, who actually international law would allow you to detain, not in the manner in which they have been detained, mind you, but that international law would allow you to detain. But we have absolutely no way, you're quite right, of making that case to anybody else in the world. And the next administration inherits that, and is going to have to live with it, and is going to have to live with the public relations image consequences of it, and that is a terrible thing. The second point, I think, is a broader one that you raise, which is that there are, and I think in a number of issues that we could raise this with, Democrats will take a very different approach to the issue. Will take a more consultative, a more open approach. Will be more willing to go out to the rest of the world and say, this is what we're doing, and this is why, and this is how we want to try to do it in the context of international law and international organizations. But ultimately, in the same way that the U.S. always has, there will come the moment that we'll say, if there are 10 people that we think we ought to keep locked up for the rest of their lives, we're going to just assert our rights as a state to do that. End of discussion. And that's always been something that has caused the U.S. trouble with the rest of the world, and it isn't going to change now. We were talking before about issues to put into this discussion. You mentioned the International Criminal Court. Which is another great example, because there are ways that right from the get-go a new administration can, and I think will, sort of stop the Bush administration's feud with the rest of the world over the International Criminal Court, to stop making and stop enforcing these extremely punitive bilateral treaties, basically threatening other countries for having anything to do with the court. I think you can imagine some instances, particularly with respect to Sudan and Congo, where you could have real increased cooperation with the court in a way that should have happened from the get-go.
But they're not going to sign on to the court. They actually even say that. Obama and Clinton are on record saying that the U.S. is not going to sign on to the court. They do say what you say, that we'll try to cooperate with the court, but even the Bush administration has cooperated with the court in Sudan.
Right. And
you're right about the bilateral. I mean, I don't know what they do with the bilateral immunity agreements, that's a touchy subject, and it makes me, it just makes me wonder whether this will be like Clinton with gays in the military. That is to say that during the campaign, or at this point, it's nice to be able to say that we'll cooperate more. Once you get into office, are people in the Defense Department going to get really angry and uncooperative if you do this? I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, my perception, if I were the legal advisor to a president-elect, which I'm never going to be, I would say that actually the question of joining the ICC is a second-term issue. Now, unfortunately, correct me if I'm wrong, the next review conference of the parties is in 2010. Is that right?
I have no idea. You know more than I do.
I looked into this once for a project I was working on, and I think it comes up a little sooner, the next review conference, than is advisable from the U.S. domestic political calendar.
I see.
So, what I would, again, if I were advising a president on this, which I won't be, it's not my field, you try to signal that we want to work with the court, that we view the existence of an international criminal court as a plus for justice, not a minus.
But that was the Bush administration, or it was before the Bush administration. But the Republican view about the ICC was never that we hate international courts. The deal breaker, and I'm sure you know this, Heather, but the deal breaker was that it would have a kind of automatic jurisdiction over Americans rather than going through the Security Council, which would allow the United States to have a veto. I don't think that conservatives have to be opposed to international adjudication. The concern, there was the Yugoslavia and Rwanda cases, which are problematic and difficult, but there's nothing that threatens America's interests about those. It was always the extent to which America would commit itself to fall within that jurisdiction. I can imagine that
Eric, as you know, the court doesn't have automatic jurisdiction over Americans, and as long as we don't wreck our court system any worse than we have wrecked it in the last 7 years.
You mean because of the complementarity?
Yes, yeah, this is a scare. This is a scare thing that conservatives have been putting forward.
Yeah.
But the other point is
why do you think it's not that Heather? It's not that right. It's not that they're going to start prosecuting Americans for for implementing the death penalty or anything like that. But look. I mean, this is not pretend stuff. This is real stuff. And it's suppose we have the Obama administration, and let's suppose that which has become quite likely, that some Bush era high level official who everybody now hates is in Europe and gets a tap on the shoulder. This is going to be a tremendously big problem for an Obama administration, all of whose members hate this guy. It's going to be a huge diplomatic problem. Americans will be furious at the thought that somebody who was basically, whether he made good or bad decisions, was basically just trying to be an American government official and doing what he thought was right. And under the principle, the principle of complementarity. It's not just something that applies to the International Criminal Court. It's sort of a basic idea, and these countries think that there's a good chance that somebody in the U.S. could be prosecuted because. Look, it's quite obvious that these people are not going to be prosecuted in the United States, even though one can make some kind of argument that they've committed international crimes.
Well, let's slow down because you're putting two different things together. I mean, there's no question that if I were Donald Rumsfeld or Condoleezza Rice or Doug Feith or Paul Wolfowitz, I would conclude that I had better not go vacation in Spain or Portugal or Belgium or Germany, because all of those countries have adopted laws and have crusading. What we would call a prosecutor in the U.S. who have shown a real interest in, in the same way that they went after, blanking on his name, Chilean. Pinochet, thank you. Donald Rumsfeld's ability to take world vacations is going to be dramatically circumscribed. Now, and I think, there's a real serious risk that some, official in one of those European countries will try to do that. Now, on the other hand, I have seen zero indication that the personnel of the International Criminal Court want to take their attention away from Darfur and Congo and other places that they are actively working to go chasing after former American officials as much fun as it would be for them. So I actually think you're conflating what's a very real issue that comes out of European domestic politics and European domestic applications of international law on the one hand, which is a real serious issue, and there's frankly nothing much we can do about it except to remind those governments how embarrassing it would be for us. And how much it would distract an Obama or Clinton administration, or a McCain administration for that matter, from doing other things that are arguably more in the long-term interest of world peace than trying Don Rumsfeld, much as at one level that might be edifying for everybody.
Not for me, but everybody else.
Right. No, but we agree that it just wouldn't be an effective use of political capital. But
right.
That's a completely separate, as you know, issue from what the International Criminal Court chooses to do with its time and personnel. And those folks have tried so hard until I think they figured out that nothing they did made any difference, and you couldn't really blame them for giving up on this point, to signal to the U.S. that they were not interested in tracking down Americans.
But they can't, I mean, right now they don't have any jurisdiction over Americans except, in narrow circumstances. But they can't credibly commit to that because the same sorts of domestic pressures. Look, in Spain, there's lots of crime as well. Lots of domestic crime that ought to be dealt with, but people are focusing on crimes in other countries as well.
Well, Spaniards were killed in Chile. I mean, it's a little more. There's more of a link there than.
Well, but this is the universal jurisdiction principle. Isn't limited to cases where your own nationals are killed in these other countries, and they seem to have this broader interest. I mean, there is this, political movement that's very powerful to try to bring people to justice, and that is the justification for the ICC. So it's not surprising that Americans, who, as we've been talking about, don't always follow those rules, right? Don't always follow those rules, as you say. Even the Democratic administration, maybe because it's been given a bad hand to play by the Bush administration, isn't going to be able to follow all those rules. And so, they may not even worry about their own officials. They're going to be worried about former American officials, and they're of course going to. I suspect a lot of pressure is going to come from the Defense Department under any administration, just like in the gays in the military case, because those, they're highly nervous about this.
Well, I actually think. I mean, the gays in the military thing to me is a strong argument why no incoming Democratic president is going to try in his or her first 100 days to get the U.S. into the ICC.
Or last 100 days.
Well, but last 100 days are different. I mean, now having said that, of course, the reason you would be tempted to try to do it in your first 100 days, and this is very analogous to 1993, is I think you have to assume that you're going to have a bigger Democratic majority in Congress come next January. And you also have to assume, if you're a realist and you look at American political history, that the majority you have in January 2009 is probably the biggest majority you're going to have during your term. Because you have to. History says that you usually lose seats at the midterm. So I could see where the temptation would come to try to push it through them. But remember, the president is going to have to be dealing with Iraq. And what the hell do we do there? And how do I make good on the promises I made either to get out of Iraq or to win in Iraq, depending on whether it's McCain or one of the Democrats? You're going to have an economy that is not performing very well. So you're going to have very little money to do any of these things that you want to do, very little money to help you around the world get things done that you want to get done. And you're going to have both a domestic public and a global public saying, okay, show me how you're different. Right. You talked a beautiful game in the campaign, right. President Obama, now show me how you're different. And that, as I've said to several both foreign and domestic audiences lately, your incoming president is going to be looking for quick wins.
Well, and I think we're agreeing now because, I mean, my point was that international law, Americans don't care enough about it, and it also constrains these guys when they do something that they think Americans do care about. That it's not going to be a very high priority for them. It's going to be a low priority for them. So tell me, Heather, what do you think if Obama or Clinton becomes president? What's the sort of most dramatic thing that they'll do with respect to international law or American constitutionalism that will distinguish them from the Bush administration?
The Geneva Conventions is a big one to me. The sort of going back through the Justice Department and saying this, and this are things we won't do, this, and this are interpretations of our own laws that we don't agree with.
What about practical effects? That is, in terms of affecting people in a concrete sense, rather than statements and rhetoric and that sort of thing. What do you think will be the practical? You don't think they're going to release a lot of people from Guantanamo Bay, do you? You don't think that they're going to join the ICC? So what are they going to do that's going to be practically different?
Well, the thing is that I think the biggest practical changes are actually changes that are less immediately linked to international law. One of them will be to change the paradigm in Iraq pretty dramatically.
Yeah, well, I agree.
And there is a sort of international law or international cooperation component there, in that you would assume one of the things that will happen is a much more dramatic effort to get the neighbors and the rest of the world involved in, sort of that there be a much broader commitment to the stability of Iraq, to bring the UN back in a really big way, although it's not clear to me that the UN is actually going to agree to that.
Right.
So
I tried that also.
Yeah, so that's one big piece. A second big piece is, and this actually has important ramifications for international law, is how you conduct the war on terror, quote unquote, and how you conceptualize it. Mm-hmm. And that actually, and then that's not something that's going to happen overnight, and it shouldn't be in the headlines a lot. But for those of us who either are international lawyers or just international policy wonks, that's going to have really important ramifications in terms of how we understand what our obligations are, and frankly, returning to an era in which we do understand that we have obligations. And I would say the biggest single difference is that someone's actually going to care about international law in a way that I know
that's why I asked. That's why I asked for concrete examples. But Obama said he's going to continue the American policy of assassinating people. Right? Drop a bomb in Pakistan and kill members of Al Qaeda. That's not a change.
Well, Eric, I think it's funny to me, because I think the difference in our approach is the difference between, if you forgive me, a kind of legalistic one and a policy one. And
I'm the legalist?
Yes, you are.
I never heard that before. Okay.
Well, from where I sit, there's not a single country in the world, as I think I said earlier in another context, there's not a single country in the world that would say that where you could get the president alone in a room and the president would say, I would never assassinate anybody, I would never practice rendition. Mm-hmm. I would never, if I knew concretely there was a threat, if I knew somebody had the missile and was pointing it at us, I would never take it out. There's no country that would, there's no leader, there's never been an American president, there's no leader that would do that. So in that sense, there's a sense in which nobody takes international law very seriously. But as you know, as well as I do, no, but the whole point of international law is to make those cases as few as possible and as costly as possible.
Okay, so you think on the mark, so you think there'll be a difference, but it won't fit into these nice legal categories. You just think that Obama and Clinton will be, to use a loaded word, less reckless. They'll assassinate people only when you're 99% sure rather than 50% sure or 1% sure, if that's the rule that Cheney uses. Mm-hmm. And you'll torture people only in the absolutely most extreme circumstances, and you're not going to torture the entire any member of Al Qaeda that you pick up. Is that what you mean? That
yes.
They'll just do the cost benefit analysis, and they'll assign a higher cost to violations of civil liberties, offending foreign countries, and that sort of thing.
And assign a higher value to being or being perceived to be in line with the broad sweep of international law. Mm-hmm. So that to me is a real change. But I see where if you're looking at it from a sort of words on paper perspective, it's not. My favorite example about this is the landmines treaty, mm-hmm. actually. And I spent a bunch of time negotiating at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and watched this kind of difference up close, but she really saw it with the Landmines Convention, where NATO, as you may remember, actually had quite a number of landmines planted along what had been the Soviet and is now the Russian border. Mm-hmm. And so you had some countries, Norway being one, that were enormous sponsors of the Landmine Convention. And, you said to the Norwegians, but so does that mean you're planning to take out all the landmines along the border with Russia? Well, no, actually, but those were NATO landmines, so they weren't Norway's problem. Mm-hmm. Now, if you read the treaty, that isn't what the treaty said. Mm-hmm. And Norway is a country that's much more congenial to international law than a lot of countries. But the fact that the Norwegians said, oh, well, but those aren't, we don't take full responsibility for those, so we don't see any contradiction between the two. Whereas in the U.S., there just would have been howling and screaming and crying about that. That to me is a great example of how, the Landmine Convention has been very useful, and the fact that the Norwegians were maybe a little hypocritical about it didn't actually make it any less useful at all. So this is why
I'm a little puzzled by that because, international law, there are two ways to violate international law. One is to say, I don't care about international law, I'm going to do what I feel like. The Bush administration has done that a few times. I think that's extremely unwise. The other way to violate international law is to interpret it narrowly. And in some cases, you'll get people will accuse you of hypocrisy, but it's easier to get away with it that way. The Bush administration has done that a lot. So has other administrations, of course. And the Clinton administration, sometimes it interpreted the rules narrowly, sometimes it ignored them. Mm-hmm. But the question then, if you're just going to interpret them, I'm not sure what the lesson of the Norway case is. If you ignore or interpret the terms narrowly, then of course there's this happy talk, which might be useful. It might be good that people are sort of talking to each other in this way. But if there's no real constraint, so what good is it doing?
But there was an enormous constraint. The Landmines Convention formed an enormous constraint, and it caused a lot of landmines to get removed. It caused a lot of varieties of landmines that were most damaging and difficult to control to stop being manufactured. It posed an enormous practical constraint.
That's what I don't understand. If Norway just adopts this transparently incorrect interpretation of the treaty, why did it have an effect?
Well, this goes back to the point you made that there are two ways to violate international law. And I think a lesson that we could draw from the last 8 years is that if you jump up and down and scream at the top of your lungs about how you don't care about international law or you don't think you're bound by it, then you will not be able to get away with narrow legalistic interpretations of it on other issues. Whereas because everybody knows the Norwegians love international law, it didn't provoke a kind of a defeating wave of cynicism about the Landmine Treaty overall. So to me, your division into two kinds of ways to break it is actually very useful in understanding where, because yes, previous American administrations practiced rendition. Previous American administrations got the telephone companies to help them, wiretap phone calls.
Invaded countries without UN authorization.
Invaded countries without UN authorization, just to pick a random one. Mm-hmm. But there was never the degree of perceived sort of utter indifference and contempt for the views of the rest of the world. And that is ultimately what has done so much harm, and that's what a Democratic administration will definitely change.
Okay, well, I think a lot rides on this because I agree with you. I think the Bush administration should not have shown so much contempt for international law, and should not have been so dismissive about the interests of other countries. But at least in my narrow world, in my very narrow world, which may be of no interest to reasonable people and people who are involved in policy, there's a lot at stake in whether you think that states actually do comply with international law, or whether states do not, but normally in a subtle fashion evaded strictures. But that's probably limited interest. I did want to go back to one other thing you said earlier, which you thought was a big difference, which is not an international law difference, but a domestic constitutional law difference. And you think that a Democratic administration will be less, sort of pro-president's pro-president power than the Bush administration will be. And correct me if I misinterpreted what you said.
Yeah, look, I don't want to be naive about that, because I recognize that there is just a dynamic that once you've accrued power, it's very difficult to give it up. And so I don't want to suggest that I think either a President Obama or a President Clinton will come into office and say, you know what, I'm going to abjure signing statements and I'm going to sort of declare this, and this area that in fact the executive does not. So I don't think...
So what do you think they'll do, though, that'll be different?
Well, there won't be new encroachments, I think, on executive power, which seems to me to be an important change in the trend line. And, you know, I'm reminded of... I'm a big fan of Warren Christopher's. I worked for him a little bit at the State Department. But if you remember, he came into the State Department after there had been, you know, these sort of Bill Clinton passport scandals and so on during the campaign, and a bunch of other things had happened that led to people feeling that the State Department was somewhat ethically compromised. I've forgotten, when were you in the counsel's office?
In the Office of Legal Counsel? Well... I was there in 91, 92, but I was such a nothing, a low-level person that I didn't have any access to
right. No, and I think there was a lot of concern about what political appointees were doing at higher levels. I wanted to be.
I just wanted an appointee. Yeah.
No, I know, and I wanted to be sure I was explicit about that and didn't appear to be insulting you. But Christopher came in, and Christopher, of course, was a lawyer, and he called the staff in and he said, there's some policy areas where I perceive that we are walking pretty close to the line or over the line. And he said, not only do I not want to be over the line, he said, I don't want to see the line. And that, which again is not going to be very satisfying to you because it's a tonal and process difference. But that's what I expect a Clinton or Obama State Department and Justice Department to look like, and have just to reestablish the idea that we have laws and we actually, what they say matters.
Right. Well, I half agree. So I think tone is important. Despite what I've been saying before, tone is important, and it's true. And people have been hitting me over the head with this for a while now. It's quite true that in the Justice Department where I wasn't in the State Department. In the Justice Department, during the Clinton administration, the Clinton lawyers wrote very careful opinions. Careful in a legalistic sense. That is to say, they wouldn't advance legal theories that were broader than necessary to justify what the president wanted to do. But the Clinton administration Justice Department memos, and these were very competent people and very people with a lot of integrity. They are very extreme in the sense of presidential power, and I think the people there understand this. So and what if Obama is president, and after a few years you have the Congress has become Republican, majority Republican. What it means to say that the president, acts, let's say, consistently with the founder's vision, or some older vision, let's say pre-Reagan, or I don't know, somewhere between Nixon and Reagan vision, is that he'll not be able to get very much done. That the way you get things done if you're president is by being very aggressive. And I don't think if Democrats are in power, as I assume they will be, your type of argument, people will say, yes, in an ideal world we would be so far away from the line that we can't see it. But in practice, the Republicans in Congress, they're not doing that. They're being tough. They're advancing legislation that makes it impossible for our president to do what's appropriate. And I think they'll fight back, and they'll fight back just the way the lawyers in the Clinton administration fought back. I don't think this is a bad thing either. But I just think that in the long term, we will and we will increasingly have a country with an extremely powerful presidency. And I think this has more, it doesn't really have to do with partisan stuff, because this is basically a bipartisan phenomenon. It has to do with basically the problem that Congress is not a very effective institution because it's large and, all the normal reasons. And so if people want things done, generally speaking, it's going to be with presidential leadership at a minimum, and often unilateral presidential action.
Well, that I agree with you, and maybe that's a good note to end on, that actually the key factor here will be whether you have a Congress that pushes back more than Congress did for at least the first 6 years of this presidency, and that, for all the reasons you just stated, does seem to, if you have a Democratic president and for the first few years a Democratic Congress saying, I know you're tempted to do that, but you can't get away with it, and we're your own party and we won't let you get away with it, then you will actually see, if not retrenchment, at least a stop in the curve. But if Congress doesn't do that, then I think you're right about the executive power trend. Eric, this has been a lot of fun.
Yes, I had a great time. Thanks, Heather.
Oh, you're very welcome. Should we?
Are we done?
Bye-bye, nation.
Okay.